Chapter 1. A Clash of Worlds. The Valari Dominion had ruled the stars for millennia, its reach stretching across countless systems, each world bound by the unyielding authority of the celestial sovereign. Princess Sura Velzorith, heir to the Dominion's vast empire, had been raised in the halls of opulence and power, her every step dictated by decorum, her every word measured against the weight of tradition. From the moment of her birth, she had been trained in the ways of royal diplomacy, interstellar strategy, and the delicate art of maintaining an aura of supreme authority. To falter, to break decorum, even for a moment, was to invite weakness, a trait that was intolerable for the one who would one day ascend the celestial throne. No emotion, no hesitation, only absolute composure. And yet, as she sat upon her high throne, her golden robes cascading over the armrests like flowing rivers of light, her poise was tested as never before. Before her, standing in the grand hall of the imperial court, was a human. He was unlike any warrior she had seen before. Where the elite Valari blade masters stood tall and regal, moving with the effortless grace of beings bred for war, the human stood with a casual confidence that bordered on audacity. He had been stripped of his armor, forced to don a simple tunic and trousers, yet his presence commanded the room as if he were the one seated upon the throne. His arms were crossed, his gaze unwavering, piercing through the air between them as if undaunted by the weight of the empire pressing down upon him. His name was Commander Dorian Kane, a warrior from a people who should not have been capable of standing against the might of the Valari. And yet, in the past 10 years, humanity had rewritten the laws of war, their unconventional tactics and defiance of established galactic order, making them both a mystery and a threat. The Dominion had long dismissed them as little more than a primitive species until their fleets began winning battles they had no right to win, until their soldiers started emerging victorious from conflicts that should have crushed them. And now, one of them stood before her. Silyara did not allow her irritation to show, nor did she allow the moment of uncertainty in her mind to reflect in her expression. Composure was everything. The royal court was assembled, dozens of nobles, military officers, and high-ranking officials watching in silence, their golden robes shimmering under the soft glow of the chamber's suspended orbs of light. This was not merely an audience. It was a performance, one in which she could not afford to falter. Her voice, when she finally spoke, was measured, each syllable carrying the weight of centuries of imperial rule. "You are far from your world, human." The words echoed across the vast chamber, each one chosen with intent. A reminder of his insignificance. A warning of the power that surrounded him. Commander Kane did not bow, did not avert his gaze as any lesser being would have done in her presence. Instead, he tilted his head slightly, his lips quirking into what could have been amusement or defiance. "I noticed," he said, his voice steady. Not exactly a warm welcome. The room grew even more silent, if such a thing were possible. Whispers moved like ghostly currents between the gathered nobility. This human spoke with disrespect, without reverence for the throne before him. It was unacceptable, and yet intriguing. Silyara did not allow her posture to change. She could not afford to react, not to him, not to the murmurs of those who watched. Instead, she leaned forward ever so slightly, her gaze sharpening. "You stand before the heart of the Dominion," she said smoothly. "You will choose your words carefully, or you will not be permitted to speak again." Kane's smirk did not fade. If anything, it deepened, a flicker of something almost reckless glinting in his steel-gray eyes. "Oh, would that be before or after your people execute me? Because let's be honest, I am not here as a guest." A single, sharp intake of breath from one of the nobles. A flicker of movement from the imperial sentinels who stood flanking the throne, their hands resting upon the hilt of their ceremonial blades, ready to strike at the first command. Silyara had not ordered his death knot yet, and that was precisely what made this moment so dangerous. She knew what was expected of her. A lesser being who spoke out of turn, who disrespected the throne, who refused to kneel. Such defiance could not go unanswered. The weight of custom, of duty, of imperial history itself demanded that she give the order to have him executed before the assembled court. But she did not. Instead, she allowed a small, calculated pause, letting the silence stretch between them, letting him feel the enormity of what he had just done. Then, she stood. The subtle shift in her posture drew the attention of every noble in the chamber. No one moved when the princess stood. It was a moment of significance, an action that carried the same gravity as the stars shifting in the heavens. Silyara descended the steps of the dais, her golden robes trailing behind her, the delicate chime of her ceremonial jewelry the only sound in the room as she crossed the expanse between herself and the human. Cain did not move. He was taller than she had anticipated, even without his armor, his presence one of restrained strength, not the forced discipline of a soldier conditioned to obey, but the confidence of a warrior who had already decided he would not yield. Silyara halted barely an arm's length away from him. The air between them was charged, a silent battle of presence and control. "You assume much, human," she said softly, her voice now low enough that only he could hear her. "Do you truly believe yourself so indispensable that we would waste our time with such games?" Cain's eyes flickered with something unreadable. "I think," he replied, "that you wouldn't be standing here if you'd already made up your mind about me." The audacity. Silyara felt something stir within her, something dangerously close to amusement, but she crushed it before it could reach the surface. This was not a man who feared death. That much was clear. But more than that, this was not a man who played by the rules of the court. And that, she realized, was what unsettled her the most. The Dominion ruled through order, through control, through the quiet knowledge that no one could ever challenge its supremacy. But humans did not adhere to control. They defied it, redefined it, bent it to their own will. They were chaotic, unpredictable, unshackled by the traditions that bound every other empire in the galaxy. Silyara could not show weakness. But for the first time in her life, she was unsure whether this moment was a test for the human, or for herself. And as she held his gaze, feeling the weight of the court upon her shoulders, she knew that this was only the beginning. This warrior had come to the heart of the Dominion, and he would not kneel. The silence stretched between them like a taut wire, ready to snap at the slightest misstep. The air in the grand chamber of the Valari imperial court was thick with expectation, the gathered nobles and military officials watching intently, their gazes sharp as blades. Silyara could feel their collective scrutiny like the weight of 1,000 unseen hands pressing against her shoulders. She was supposed to act, to uphold the rigid protocols that had defined her people for centuries. A defiant prisoner did not get to stand before the heir to the celestial throne and leave unscathed. And yet, she found herself hesitating. Commander Dorian Cain did not flinch under her scrutiny. The human stood tall, unwavering, even as her presence loomed before him. His steel-gray eyes held no fear, no supplication, only the quiet, unshakable resolve of a warrior who had long since accepted the nature of his existence. He was not bound by the rigid structures of a noble court, nor did he carry the weight of ancestral duty on his back. He was simply a man who had fought, bled, and survived on his own terms. That realization unsettled her more than she cared to admit. Silyara exhaled slowly, controlling the rhythm of her breath. She had fought in battle before. She had faced warlords, assassins, and traitors. But this moment, this exchange, was unlike anything she had ever encountered. There was no battlefield here, no clash of blades or thunderous cannon fire. This was a duel of presence, of will. And she had no intention of losing. She took another step forward, closing the gap between them until she was close enough to see the faint scars on his weathered skin, the subtle tension in his muscles, the quiet calculation in his eyes. She had learned long ago that warriors, true warriors, could not be understood by their words alone. It was in the way they stood, the way they breathed, the way their eyes tracked movement even in stillness. Dorian Cain was watching her as intently as she was watching him. The corners of her lips curved ever so slightly, not a smile, but something more deliberate. A message. "You do not kneel," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Cain's response was immediate. "I do not. Not even before a throne that could see you executed in a breath." His eyes held hers without faltering, especially not before that kind of throne. A sharp, almost imperceptible inhale echoed from somewhere in the chamber. The nobles watching this exchange were barely containing their dismay. This was unacceptable. It was beyond disrespect. It was a direct challenge to her authority. Silyara tilted her head slightly, studying him. "You should have begged for mercy the moment you were brought before me." Cain shrugged. "I don't beg. Not for mercy, not for survival, and certainly not for the approval of those who think their power is absolute." The court gasped. It was the kind of insult that would have seen any other prisoner cut down on the spot. The Imperial sentinels flanking the throne had already moved their hands to their weapons, awaiting only a command. The nobles whispered among themselves, scandalized, unable to comprehend why the princess had not yet given the order. Silyara knew she should have. She knew the law. She knew what was expected of her. And yet, deep within her, she felt something far more dangerous than anger. She felt curiosity. The human was dangerous, there was no doubt about that. He had been captured after leading a daring raid on the Dominion's outer territories, his small fleet managing to cripple a Valari dreadnought before being overwhelmed. He was a warrior from a people who should not have been able to stand against the might of her empire. And yet, time and again, humanity defied expectations. They were a species of survivors, of warriors, of rule breakers who refused to accept the natural order. Perhaps that was why she did not give the order. Perhaps that was why, when she spoke again, her words were not a sentence of execution. Instead, she asked, "What is it that you fight for, human?" For the first time, Kane hesitated. Not long, just a flicker of a pause, so brief that most would not have noticed it. But Silyara saw it. She caught the shift in his expression, the way something deep and guarded flickered behind his eyes. Then, his lips pressed into a firm line. "Freedom," he said simply. Silyara studied him for a moment longer, then finally stepped back. "Then we are at an impasse, Commander Kane. Because the Dominion does not suffer rebellion. And I don't suffer tyrants," he replied. Silyara let out a quiet breath, not quite a sigh, but something close. "Then I suppose this is where our battle truly begins." And with those words, she turned away, walking back toward the throne, knowing that this was far from over. The human warrior had challenged her, and she had every intention of proving why the Valari Dominion had ruled for millennia. Chapter 2. The Trial of Might. The great halls of the Imperial Arena were bathed in golden firelight, the towering obsidian pillars casting long shadows across the vast stone floors. This was a place of tradition, of spectacle and judgment, where the fate of warriors was decided not by words, but by blood. It was here that Kane's trial would take place. Silyara stood upon the high balcony, overlooking the circular arena below, where Kane had been brought and shackled in luminous energy cuffs, his wrists bound in containment fields that flickered with soft azure light. Even now, he remained unbowed, his gaze sweeping across the Colosseum, taking in the rows of Valari spectators who had gathered to witness his fate. The arena was a sacred place, a proving ground where the accused could earn their right to live if they survived. It was not a mercy, but a test, one that very few ever passed. The nobles in attendance had no doubt that this would be the end of the human. Silyara, however, was not so sure. She watched as the arena gates slid open, revealing his opponent, a Valari blade master. The warrior was massive, clad in ceremonial armor, his twin energy-forged blades humming as he stepped forward. He was an elite of the Dominion, trained since birth in the ways of war, his speed and precision unmatched. No human had ever defeated a Valari blade master in single combat. Silyara turned her gaze to Kane, expecting to see some sign of fear. There was none. Instead, the human smirked. The energy cuffs around his wrists disengaged, the field flickering out as he rolled his shoulders, preparing for battle. And then, with a nod from the arena warden, the fight began. The blade master struck first, moving with impossible speed, his energy blades slicing through the air in a blur of golden light. But Kane was faster. He dodged, not with the rigid, practiced footwork of the Dominion warriors, but with a fluid, unpredictable motion that sent him weaving around the strike at an angle that should not have been possible. He wasn't fighting like they expected. He wasn't fighting like them at all. Silyara's eyes narrowed. Kane was smiling. Then, in a single, brutal counterattack, the human warrior moved and the arena gasped. The arena held its breath. The moment the Valari blade master's strike missed, the illusion of inevitable victory shattered. In the grand history of the Dominion, no human had ever lasted longer than a breath against a trained blade master. But here, in this sacred place of combat, Dorian Kane was still standing. The blade master recovered instantly, his body moving with the unnatural speed of his kind, his twin energy blades twisting in a fluid arc, coming at Kane from both sides. A kill strike meant to be unavoidable. The golden plasma glowed like fire, humming with a deadly frequency that could cut through any known metal, any armor, any being. But Kane did not wear armor. He wore nothing but his instincts. As the blades closed in, He moved again, not back, not away but forward. A reckless, impossible decision that no warrior trained in conventional battle would have made. But Kane was not like them. The second before the plasma could connect, he twisted his body low, dropping his center of gravity faster than the Blade Master expected. The golden blade slashed through empty air where Kane's head had been an instant before. And in that split second, before the Blade Master could adjust his momentum, Kane struck. A palm strike, brutal, precise, slammed into the Blade Master's ribs. There was a sickening crack as the force of the impact disrupted the warrior's balance. Kane followed through instantly, driving his elbow into the Valari's jaw, sending the towering figure stumbling back, a Blade Master, stumbling, in front of the entire Imperial court. The arena erupted in stunned gasps. From her balcony, Princess Silyara's fingers tightened around the railing. She had seen humans fight before, but never like this. Never with such calculated savagery. Her Blade Master had centuries of experience. His techniques were flawless, his blade work superior to any species in the known galaxy. And yet, Kane had evaded him, struck him, forced him back. It was impossible. And yet, it had happened. The Blade Master let out a slow breath, his golden eyes narrowing. There was no anger, no prideful rage, only a renewed focus. He knew now that this was no ordinary fight. Kane exhaled through his nose, rolling his shoulders. That was the warm-up, he muttered. Good. Thought you were holding back. The Blade Master moved again, faster this time. Kane barely dodged the first strike, the sheer heat of the plasma blade singing the air inches from his skin. He pivoted, his footwork wild and erratic. No, deliberate. Valari warriors were trained to read movements, to predict patterns. Kane gave them none. He did not fight like a swordsman. He fought like a predator. Every move was designed to disrupt, to force tiny fractures in the Blade Master's momentum. A flicker of fainting footwork, a twist of the torso, a sidestep at the last possible moment, a constant, shifting battlefield that kept the warrior from ever fully adjusting. But Kane wasn't just dodging. He was studying. His steel-gray eyes locked onto the way the Blade Master swung his weapons, the microsecond lag between each movement. He was learning the rhythm of his opponent, adapting in real time. The crowd did not know what to make of what they were witnessing. Silyara, however, knew exactly what she was seeing. This human was not merely surviving. He was hunting. The Blade Master, despite his skill, despite his centuries of training, was being pushed to react rather than dictate. That should not have been possible. Kane saw it too. And then he attacked. It happened in an instant. A calculated shift in weight, a sudden pivot, and Kane launched himself forward, too close for the Blade Master's weapons to adjust in time. A brutal strike to the wrist, the Blade Master's right-hand blade clattered to the ground. The Valari barely had time to react before Kane twisted into a spinning kick, landing a devastating blow to the warrior's ribcage. The Blade Master collapsed onto one knee. The arena fell into stunned silence. Kane stood over him, breathing heavily but unbroken. Your move, he muttered. From above, Silyara finally spoke. Enough. Her voice was like a bell ringing through the chamber. The duel was over. Kane had won, and the Dominion had never seen anything like it before. Chapter 3, The Warrior and the Throne. The chamber was silent. Not merely quiet but silent, in the way a universe holds its breath before the birth of a star. The Valari Dominion had watched, believing they knew the inevitable outcome of this trial. They had believed that their Blade Master would win, that the human would be cut down in the sand like so many before him. But now, the impossible had happened. Dorian Kane stood victorious. Silyara remained seated upon the throne, but her mind was racing. This human had just rewritten the Dominion's understanding of war. He had not fought with their precision, nor with their philosophy of technique and honor. He had fought like a man who had been in real wars, where there was no ceremony, no perfect form, only the will to survive. And he had won. Kane wiped the sweat from his brow, exhaling sharply. His body bore bruises from near misses, but his breathing remained steady, his posture unbroken. He had never expected to win. That much was clear. But he had never expected to lose, either. He turned his gaze up to Silyara, and for the first time, something passed between them, not defiance, not hostility, but something more dangerous. Recognition. The princess stood from her throne. The nobles held their breath, waiting for her command. The human had won the fight, but that did not mean he would be allowed to leave alive. But Silyara did not give the execution order. Instead, She descended the steps slowly, her golden robes trailing behind her like flowing rivers of sunlight. She reached the edge of the arena, stepping onto the sand, her presence commanding without a single word. Kane watched her approach, his expression unreadable. When she finally stood before him, the same closeness as before, Soyara met his gaze directly. And then, to the absolute shock of every noble, every warrior, every official present, she spoke words that had never been uttered in Dominion history. Dorian Kane, you have proven yourself in battle. The Dominion does not execute those who earn their place. Kane blinked. Meaning what? Soyara tilted her head slightly. You belong to me now. The arena erupted. The arena descended into chaos. The gathered nobles, warriors, and high-ranking officials erupted into heated discussion, their voices rising in disbelief, in protest, in barely contained outrage. The Dominion had never allowed a prisoner to walk away from the trial of might, let alone a human. The idea that Princess Soyara, heir to the celestial throne, had just declared him hers was beyond comprehension. Kane did not flinch. His eyes remained locked onto Soyara, studying her as intently as she had been studying him since the moment he had entered her court. She had taken a risk, an impossible, unprecedented risk. And for what? To keep him alive? To use him? He smirked. Define belong, princess. Soyara's expression did not change. The Dominion does not suffer rogue warriors, she said evenly, her golden eyes unyielding. Nor does it waste useful ones. The court chamber roared with protest. This is madness, one noble barked, stepping forward. The human should be executed, not kept like some kind of pet. Soyara's gaze snapped to him with lethal precision, and the noble immediately halted, realizing too late that he had spoken out of turn. This pet, Soyara said coldly, just defeated a blade master in single combat. Perhaps we should reconsider who is disposable in this chamber. The silence that followed was absolute. The nobles stiffened, lowering their heads in deference, though resentment still simmered beneath the surface. Soyara ignored them, her focus returning to Kane. You fight for freedom, she continued, but you have none here. Your options are simple: remain as my prisoner, or serve the throne. Kane exhaled through his nose, shaking his head slightly. Sounds a lot like two different shades of the same cage. Soyara's lips twitched, not quite a smirk, but close. Perhaps, but in one of them, you keep your head. Kane studied her, considering. He had faced death countless times, fought wars on worlds that had been reduced to little more than smoking wreckage. He knew how to recognize an enemy's true intent. Soyara was not offering him mercy. She was gambling. She had just defied every expectation, shattered every law of the Dominion's rigid traditions, all for a single calculated reason. She wanted to know what made humans so dangerous. She wanted to understand him. And Kane was never one to turn down a good gamble. He rolled his shoulders, tilting his head slightly. All right, princess, he muttered. Let's see where this game takes us. Soyara nodded, as if his acceptance had been inevitable. Then, without another word, she turned and walked away, leaving Kane standing in the middle of the blood-stained arena. The warriors of the Dominion watched in stunned silence as the human followed. Chapter 4, Shadows and Steel. The Imperial Palace was unlike anything Kane had ever seen. Towering spires of black stone pierced the sky, their edges glowing with soft veins of golden energy, as if the very structure pulsed with the lifeblood of the empire itself. The hallways were endless corridors of dark marble and burning braziers, each step echoing across the polished floors, as if the palace were whispering secrets to itself. Kane followed Soyara through the halls, flanked by two Valari sentinels, their weapons humming at their sides, watching him like a predator might watch a potential threat. He didn't blame them. His very presence here was an insult to everything the Dominion stood for. And yet, Soyara had made her decision, and not a single person in the court had dared to defy her to her face. Which meant two things. 1. They feared her. 2. Someone would try to kill him before the night was over. Finally, they reached a vast chamber, lined with intricate carvings of Valari history, depicting long-forgotten wars and conquests. Soyara stepped forward, her golden robes flowing behind her as she turned to face Kane. Your presence in this palace, she said, is an anomaly. I have no doubt that many among my people will seek to remove it. Kane smirked. That's a fancy way of saying someone's going to stab me in my sleep. Soyara did not disagree. You intrigue me, Commander Kane, she admitted, stepping closer. Your people defy logic. Your tactics defy convention. And you, in particular, defy expectation. Kane crossed his arms, watching her. And what do you plan to do with that information? Silyara tilted her head. Learn from it. Kane let out a quiet laugh. You're studying me. She didn't deny it. Perhaps, she said smoothly. Or perhaps I am determining whether you are more useful as an ally, or as a threat to be eliminated. Kane's smirk remained, but his stance shifted slightly. Not a threat, but a subtle reminder that he was not a man who could be controlled. And what's the verdict so far? He asked. Silyara met his gaze, and for the first time, he saw something there that he hadn't seen before. Curiosity, respect, a challenge. She turned away, walking toward the large balcony that overlooked the sprawling city beyond. The Dominion was vast, endless, unstoppable. And yet, for the first time in her life, Silyara wondered if that was really true. She had been raised to believe that the Valari were the pinnacle of civilization, that their way was absolute, that their power could not be questioned. But Dorian Kane had just proven otherwise. And if one human could do that, what else were they capable of? Silyara exhaled softly, glancing over her shoulder at him. You will remain here, she declared. You will be given quarters, though I imagine you will find little comfort in them. Kane chuckled. Not the worst accommodations I've had. Silyara continued. I will call upon you when I require your presence. Until then, you would be wise to remain cautious. My protection is not absolute. Kane's smirk faded slightly. He wasn't a fool. He knew he was walking on a knife's edge. But for some reason, he wasn't afraid. As Silyara turned back toward the balcony, watching the distant lights of the empire she would one day rule, Kane spoke one last time. You're not like them, are you? Silyara paused. Then, without turning, she answered, and you're not like the rest of your kind. A truth neither of them were willing to say aloud. A dangerous truth. One that would change the fate of two empires forever. The night stretched long over the Valari Imperial Palace, the twin moons casting their silver glow upon the towering black spires, their soft light reflecting off the veins of golden energy pulsing through the walls. The palace was alive even in the stillness, a sleeping beast that never truly rested. Every corridor, every chamber, every shadow concealed the weight of ancient power and unyielding authority. It was a fortress of tradition, a stronghold where no outsider had ever been permitted to walk freely. And yet, tonight, a human warrior did. Dorian Kane had been given quarters, if they could be called that. The chamber was vast, larger than any command barracks he had ever seen, its walls adorned with intricate carvings of Valari history, tales of conquest and rule, battles fought in distant star systems long before humanity had even reached the stars. It was a monument to their pride, to their supremacy. A quiet hum echoed through the room, the soft glow of floating orbs illuminating the space with a golden sheen. The bed was made of some kind of silken material, impossibly soft, yet Kane did not sit on it. He stood near the center of the chamber, arms crossed, waiting, because he knew someone would come for him tonight. They wouldn't risk trying to execute him in the arena, not in front of the entire court, not while the princess had claimed him as her possession. But that did not mean they would accept his presence. No, they would try to remove him quietly. He welcomed it. A part of him wanted to see how far they would go, how desperate they were to undo what had happened today, how afraid they were of what he represented. So he waited, and they did not disappoint. The moment the orbs dimmed just slightly, just enough to make the room feel heavier, as if the palace itself had drawn a breath, they came. Silent, disciplined, deadly. For figures moved as shadows, their sleek armor blackened to blend into the void, their weapons drawn, each blade coated with an energy field designed to slice through even the toughest exosuit. Assassins of the Dominion. They moved without hesitation, without error, or so they thought. Kane had been expecting them. The second they crossed the threshold, he moved. Not like the warriors of the Dominion, not with their precise footwork and measured grace. He moved like a man who had survived battles fought in darkness, where there were no honor codes, no ceremonial duels, only the brutal certainty of life or death. The first assassin barely had time to react before Kane's elbow smashed into his throat. A sharp gasp escaped the Valari's lips, but the human was already pivoting, grabbing the assassin's wrist before twisting it at an unnatural angle. The blade in his hand now belonged to Kane. In a single fluid motion, Kane turned the weapon on its former owner. The assassin fell without a sound. The remaining 3 attacked at once. Blades flashed, energy crackling through the air as they struck from 3 different angles, flanking maneuvers designed to overwhelm even the most skilled opponent. But Kane was not where they expected him to be. He ducked low, avoiding a killing blow by mere inches, his movements fast and unpredictable. Valari warriors relied on reading patterns, on predicting an enemy's next step. But Kane did not fight in patterns. His world had taught him something very different. Survival was about disruption, unpredictability, adaptability. The second assassin lunged, his blade aimed for Kane's ribs, but the human turned into the strike rather than away from it, defying instinct. His shoulder crashed into the assassin's chest, sending him staggering backward. Before the Valari could recover, Kane drove his stolen blade into his abdomen. The third and fourth assassins hesitated for only a fraction of a second. It was enough. Kane closed the distance between them in a blink. A vicious backhand sent one staggering, while the other swung their blade in a last-ditch effort only for Kane to catch their wrist, twisting it until the weapon clattered to the ground. A moment later, so did the assassin. The last remaining Valari assassin, still reeling from the impact of Kane's strike, stared in disbelief. His comrades lay motionless on the cold floor, the chamber silent except for the lingering hum of energy still crackling from the fallen blades. Kane let out a slow breath, rolling his shoulders. "Not bad," he muttered. "But you lot are way too predictable." The assassin reached for a concealed dagger, but Kane was faster. In a single motion, he kicked the weapon out of reach, stepping forward until he towered over the last Valari standing. His steel-gray eyes were unreadable. "You're going to deliver a message for me," Kane said quietly. The assassin, still stunned, swallowed hard. "Tell your people," Kane continued, voice low, unshaken, "that if they want to kill me, they'd better send someone better next time." The assassin hesitated, then fled into the shadows. Kane exhaled, shaking his head. He hadn't expected to survive a full day in the palace, let alone be testing its defenses already. But more than that, he knew what this meant. They weren't just trying to kill him. They were testing him. And they had just learned why that was a bad idea. The throne room, the next move. When Silyara was informed of the failed assassination, she was not surprised. She had expected it. What she had not expected was for Kane to defeat them so effortlessly. Now, as she sat upon her throne, her golden eyes fixated on him with renewed scrutiny, she knew that she had not simply taken a prisoner. She had taken a weapon. "Did you enjoy yourself last night?" she asked, her voice smooth, unreadable. Kane smirked. Would have been more fun if they sent a challenge. Some of the nobles visibly stiffened, clearly displeased by his flippancy. Silyara simply watched him for a long moment before speaking. "You have made many enemies here, human." Kane tilted his head. "Seems like I made at least one ally." She did not correct him. Instead, she stood, stepping forward, closing the space between them. When she spoke again, her words were softer but not weak. "Never weak. You intrigue me, Dorian Kane," she admitted. "And that is not something I say lightly." Kane crossed his arms, waiting. "Your people are a mystery, a threat, a force we have never encountered before." She paused, her gaze unreadable. "And I do not believe that will change anytime soon." Kane smirked. "I'd be disappointed if it did." Silyara studied him. Then, for the first time, she allowed the faintest hint of amusement to touch her lips. A dangerous thing. Something was changing between them. Something neither of them could yet name. But one thing was certain. The Dominion would never be the same again. Epilogue. The beginning of a legend. The Valari Dominion was not accustomed to change. It had ruled the stars for millennia with iron discipline, its traditions unchallenged, its supremacy unquestioned. And yet, in the vast corridors of its most sacred halls, something new had taken root. A human warrior had survived where none should have. A princess had broken tradition to spare his life. And now, the weight of that decision would ripple across the galaxy. The throne room, 1 month later. The grand hall of the Dominion's high court was filled with the highest-ranking nobles, warriors, and diplomats, each standing in stunned, forced silence as Princess Silyara made her way to the throne, her golden robes flowing like liquid light. Beside her, walking with casual confidence, was Commander Dorian Kane. A human. They still whispered about it. They still feared it. Some had tried to kill him in the shadows, their blades meant to end the insult before it could take root. He had killed them instead. Some had sought to undermine Silyara's authority, to question why she would allow an outsider to live. They no longer spoke. Now, They all stood in forced reverence, watching the impossible unfold before them. As Cilara took her seat upon the throne, Kane stood at her right side not as a prisoner, not as a trophy, but as something else entirely. A symbol, a challenge, the war to come. Beyond the palace walls, the galaxy was shifting. The Dominion's enemies had taken notice. The resistance, long thought to be crushed under the Empire's rule, was stirring. The human colonies, watching from the edges of space, were waiting to see what came next. And somewhere, in the dark void between worlds, a war was brewing. Because the moment a single human warrior had stood victorious in the Dominion's most sacred trial, everything had changed. Kane had fought his battle. Now, he and Cilara would fight a war. Together,